Well, hello everyone. Apologies for the delay and welcome to this session entitled Climate Action and Environmental Impact, the Role of the Local Planning Authority. My name is Martin Reed. I'm editor of The Planner, and you're watching the latest in a series of events that collectively comprise the Planner Live Online, the RTPI's alternative planning convention for 2020. Firstly, some housekeeping. We're keen to keep the conversation going, so do please get involved on Twitter using the hashtag PlannerLiveOnline. And also, if you look at the handout section on your GoToWebinar control panel, you will find links to RTPI work related to this session in a PDF that you can download directly from there. By the way, if you're watching this session as a recording, don't worry, those links will still be available on the Planner Live Online website, and you can find that at rtpi.org.uk/plannerlive. Okay, so I need to move one slide on, so bear with me a second. Right, here's how this session will work. We have 3 short presentations giving 3 different perspectives, and that will be followed by questions and answers. In a minute, I'll be handing over to Richard Blyth, Head of Research at the RTPI, to give some context to this session, specifically with relation to the Institute's just published Plan the World We Need campaign. We'll then hear from we expect to hear from Rebecca Wrigley, Chief Executive of Rewilding Britain, as the broadcast goes on. But in the first instance, we're going to be hearing from Deryck Irving, Director of Strategy and Development at the Central Scotland Green Network Trust, one of the largest green space projects in Europe, who will explain the Trust work and give his perspective on the role of planning in delivering the network. And then finally, we have Jeremy Potter. Jeremy is the Spatial Planning Services Manager with Chelmsford City Council. And Jeremy has just recently seen his authority's local plan, designed to push the boundaries of policy to affect genuine environmental change, adopted. Jeremy will explain to us how his team's plan came to fruition and the lessons they learned along the way. And now, following Jeremy, we'll enter a Q&A session. We'll hear hopefully from Rebecca if she joins us during the presentation. Our guests are likely to have their own questions of each other, but I'm here to ask any questions that you have of them. So please do ask away as the session progresses, and I promise I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So on we go. It's with the launch of the RTPI's Plan the World We Need campaign that this Planner Live Online week started. So it's going to be over to you, Richard, to tell us what it says about that topic. Richard.
Yes, well, this week the RTPI launched a far-reaching national campaign calling on governments across the UK and Ireland to capitalise on the expertise of planners to achieve a sustainable, resilient and inclusive recovery. The first element in this campaign, which is overall called Plan the World We Need, is a long-form report with that title from our research staff, which sets out where we are in relation to the virus COVID-19 at the moment and where we think we should go from here across the 4 nations of the UK. The epidemic has brought into sharp focus the strengths and weaknesses of our places and our way of life, and it's now vital that we plan a greener place-based recovery that responds not only to the lessons learned from the pandemic, but also the challenges that we've been grappling with long before COVID, particularly climate change. The report covers health and well-being in Chapter 2, the economy in Chapter 3, transport in Chapter 4, net zero in Chapter 5, and then culminating in a place-based recovery, which is where we think we should be going next. I won't cover all of those, but just for example, in the transport chapter, we conclude that planning can integrate temporary measures to enable walking and cycling into wider strategies for place, locking in long-term shifts in travel behaviour. We say that we should be engaging with communities and businesses to ensure that changes meet a range of mobility needs. We should collaborate on temporary measures to support sustainable mobility in car-dependent locations. We're very concerned about the potential proliferation of further car-dependent locations in the future and think that we should really see a step change away from this kind of policy. And finally, we should design and locate new development to maximise accessibility by public, active and shared modes of transport. Patterns of housing and commercial development must support urban regeneration and renewal and provide levels of patronage which support the recovery of public and shared transport providers, rather than diverting public funds towards the expansion of the road network to accommodate car use. The RTPI's campaign is totally in line with findings from the Committee on Climate Change, which last week published its 2020 report to Parliament, assessing progress on reducing the UK emissions over the past year. The committee concludes that the test for planning reform is really whether it contributes to a zero carbon future. So we need a strong, well-resourced and proactive planning system in all the nations of the UK. Otherwise, we risk a fragmented recovery which misses key opportunities to improve places for the most vulnerable in society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. That's a very succinct summary of the campaign and report's findings. We'll obviously come back to some of those elements at the Q&A session. For now, we're going to go to Deryck Irving. Deryck, bear with me a second as I move you and to presenter mode. Bear with me a second. Okay, moving across. Deryck, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. I'm just desperately trying to work out how to share my screen now because it hasn't offered me the option. Oh, now that's strange. Excuse me a second. Now, for some reason, I'm not being offered the opportunity to share my screen here.
Okay, so bear with me a second. I see what this is.
Oh, here we go.
Hang on a second, Deryck. We're just moving it across. Okay, how's that?
That should be okay. Is everybody seeing that?
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to take you through a very short whistle-stop tour of the Central Scotland Green Network and discuss our views on the role of planning in its delivery. As you can see from the first slide here, this is a large area of Central Scotland, which we're looking at, covering the 3 Ayrshire authorities, the 8 authorities in Glasgow Clyde Valley, 3 in Forth Valley, and the 4 in Lothians and Fife. Moving from South Ayrshire in the west to East Lothian in the east, across much of the industrial heartland of Scotland. Central Scotland Green Network is one of 14 national developments in Scotland's 3rd National Planning Framework. One of the largest green space projects in Europe. As you can see, it's a scale of about 10,000 square kilometres. Much of the project area, as I mentioned already, shows the impact of former industry, and you'll see there the level of vacant derelict land, for example. And crucially, this is a long-term initiative with a 2050 target, and it's using environmental solutions to deliver economic and social benefits. I work for the Central Scotland Green Network Trust. We're an independent charity which was established primarily to drive forward the delivery of the network initiative, which is quite an interesting model in itself. So as a relatively small charity, our job is to coordinate and work in partnership with a wide range of public bodies, third sector partners and community organisations and private sector partners as well. We offer our partners technical support and assistance in everything from GIS through to monitoring and evaluation of progress, and we do some direct delivery of projects ourselves, primarily in the fields that are listed there, and we tend to work on the innovative projects and on the areas where perhaps action is short, so to try and kickstart work in those areas. The bulk of the delivery, however, lies with local authorities, both in terms of their direct delivery of green space and also in the role and action of the local development plan and associated strategies. It's not all plain sailing. Having national status in the planning system doesn't always read through clearly to local development plans, and quite often our feedback when we're asked about them is why you've missed the link. And there's some inconsistency about green infrastructure policy across the 19 areas that we work with. With an analysis that we commissioned with Scottish Government a couple of years ago showed that every aspect of green infrastructure policy we expected was there, but none of it was there in every local plan. So we found no area had got everything we wanted, and certain areas were very, very patchy. And even where we have planning policy, we don't always see it translating through to action. So we've seen some really, really good master plans, for example, and when we see the delivery on the ground, it seems rather underwhelming. I think there's an element of policy commitments being lost in translation or negotiated out of solutions. But there are some opportunities, and there are some promising recent developments. The 2019 Planning Scotland Act has required all the planning authorities in the area that we work in to consult us on their local development plans with regard to how they link to the Central Scotland Green Network. It's the first time we've been a statutory consultee. The new national planning framework is being developed at the moment, will be due for publication next autumn. And that will set a more consistent national Scottish planning policy, which will be part of the overall statutory plan. So we hope to see a greater consistency of policy as we move forward. There are also a number of new regional models for both spatial and land use planning, which hopefully, if they can be coordinated, will help to deliver at the scale that we're requiring. Scottish Government last year declared a climate emergency, global climate emergency, and highlighted the link across from that to the biodiversity crisis. This has definitely changed focus for public bodies particularly, and the fact that COP26 was due to be this year in Glasgow is now due to be next year in Glasgow has certainly helped to focus people's attention. And finally, on the developments, the response to the lockdown COVID-19 has strongly highlighted the need for quality local places and local environments, and also the inequalities in terms of what people have at present. And the commitment to green recovery by both UK and Scottish governments has again developed a stronger set of priorities. And my understanding is that this year's review of the investment plan in Scotland will be looking very much at environmental indicators as central. So I've heard that there are challenges with the plan's not necessarily showing what, but there are some major roles, I think, for planners in delivering success at the scale and the speed we're talking about. The subheading here, climate change, people, inclusive growth, place, are the 4 criteria against which prospective national developments for the new national planning framework will be judged. And I can't help feeling that if Patrick Geddes had known about climate change, that might well have been what he'd have picked as well. Planners have a really strong and important role in getting this. Planners will not do everything, they can't do everything, but this is about places. It's not about climate change action as an add-on, it's not about eco-bling. This is about creating healthy, sustainable, quality places which routinely use green infrastructure as part of their solutions. So we don't allow people to negotiate that out. And crucially, my final point there, and I will stop talking after I've made it, we've been incredibly successful in the last few months at pop-ups and quick wins, but I have a personal concern that that will be ticked as a box that's been completed and people will forget that long term we still have to change the way we work, the way we live and the way we operate. And planners are central to that understanding of long-term change and quality of place. Thank you.
Deryck, thank you very much. A lot of very interesting points there. It is interesting looking back the last 3 to 4 months. It's quite a chunk of time now, and there is some interesting potential there for that to be something which does tend to stick around for a bit longer. Here's hoping. In the meantime, my plan now is to hand over to Rebecca Wrigley. Bear with me a second. Need to move here. Rebecca, it's you next. Now, in Rebecca's case, she's the Chief Executive of Rewilding Britain, who is about to explain her organisation's mission and consider where planning comes into the rewilding equation. So, Rebecca, let me transfer across to you.
Thank you, Martin.
Give me a second, I just need to move you across. And there you go.
Right, great, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I mean, I have to confess I'm maybe what could be called an expert on rewilding, but I'm certainly not an expert on the planning system, but I do see that there's a huge potential for synergies to be developed. So that's part of the reason that I was really interested to talk today. So to start, I'll show a nice picture, but what I'd like to talk about, what is rewilding? I mean, there's been a lot of talk about rewilding and how it's about reintroducing wolves and apex predators, but for us, rewilding is really about the large-scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where they can start to take care of themselves. It's about restoring natural processes and also reinstating missing species where that's appropriate. But for us, rewilding is also about people. I mean, people are part of nature, and I think one of the problems in the past is that we've kind of tried to separate the two. So for us, rewilding is just as much about place, about people, about building sustainable communities, and about restoring the living systems upon which we all depend. So Rewilding Britain's principles is that rewilding is about working at nature's scale. So to restore natural processes, we need that scale, but that can come just as much from sort of large areas, but also interconnected areas. And we'd love to see those connections made right from the doorstep in people's houses and cities, out through parks, river corridors, and out into larger landscapes. And in those landscapes, we feel that it should be nature that takes the lead. We should reinstate those natural processes rather than focus on maintaining specific species. As I said, people and communities need to be at the heart of that because people are part of nature. So rewilding needs to support resilient local economies, what we're calling nature-based economies. And we think that there are lots of opportunities that are created. And again, as the previous speaker said, it's about looking for the long term. So it's about benefits for now, but also for tomorrow. And so what can those benefits be in the face of the climate and ecological emergencies? Well, we know that rewilding and reinstating those dynamic, naturally functioning ecosystems can reverse the decline in biodiversity, but we also know that it can increase carbon drawdown. So a report that we produced last year modelled that if we were to rewild and restore 6 million hectares of Britain, that could draw down 47 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year, which is equivalent to 10% of our current emissions. But we also know that climate zones are moving rapidly, possibly as fast as 5 kilometres a year. And so we need higher quality and connected habitat to allow species to move and adapt as climate zones shift. And if we don't do that, we're going to see an increase in biodiversity loss. But we also feel rewilding can provide economic opportunities and provide people with our life support systems. So there are many benefits of rewilding. And so at Rewilding Britain, our mission is to champion rewilding, to act as a catalyst for debate and action in the face of the climate ecological emergency. So we'd like to see rewilding mainstreamed within government and other key organisational policies, including the planning framework, and with financial support available for its application. And what we're doing to support that is we're setting up a rewilding network to provide support to individual landowners, councils, public landowners, estates, to massively upscale the potential for rewilding and the support that is provided, because we're getting a massive increase in people contacting us wanting to rewild. And we also want to engage key audiences. So what about rewilding and the planning system? Well, some of the challenges are around rewilding is about dynamic outcomes rather than fixed outcomes, and that can be quite difficult to accommodate sometimes. It's about building long-term ecological and climate resilience rather than short-term goals. It's about place-based and getting communities behind nature-based solutions. And it can be a cost-effective tool. Once you've kick-started restoration and rewilding, it can largely take care of itself. But as many people don't seem to particularly like, it can be messy. I mean, those dynamic outcomes are about creating dynamic change rather than kind of neatly manicured landscapes. So in terms of the planning system, I think rewilding can help us on the path to net carbon zero, and in the national planning framework, there's a requirement to meet the challenge of climate change, flooding, and coastal retreat, and rewilding can contribute towards that massively. And what we're needing to see is an upscaling of the scale of ambition. So if we're going to meet net carbon zero, we need to both reduce emissions but also draw down carbon. And everyone's expecting that to happen through, largely tree planting, but no one is coming up with the amount of land that is required to do that. And we're also ignoring the contribution that marine can play. Rewilding can also be a very cost-effective tool for flood mitigation and coastal change. And so we'd like to see a massive increase in investment in natural flood management as a really cost-effective tool, and on natural coastal defences. Rewilding can also help, as I said, reverse biodiversity loss. So conserving and enhancing the natural environment is one of the is within the national planning framework, and we feel that this will require a massive upscaling of rewilding and restoration, but also require interconnected rewilding and restoration areas across, particularly across public land. And councils and public owners own a considerable chunk of the landscape. So we'd love to see build connectivity across planning authorities to build those corridors and that connectivity. We'd like to be able to design or designate rewilding and restoration areas in a similar way that we designate conservation areas within cities, and maybe prioritise natural regeneration and restoring natural processes wherever possible. And so a few questions, and I'd be really interested in your questions and your thoughts, but how can the planning system support the scale of ambition required in the face of the climate and ecological emergencies? How can we build on and connect up existing initiatives? How can we integrate long-term multi-sectoral approaches? And we need locally led place-based structures, potentially linked to the planning authorities, that can create that locally led change. So those are just some thoughts, but I'd be really interested in the and the debate after these presentations.
Rebecca, okay, thank you very much indeed. That's all very interesting, and I think we can come back certainly to some of the questions you asked there in the general Q&A. But now I think we should go straight over to Jeremy. Jeremy Potter is someone who's been part of the team authoring the local plan just adopted there, who's about to give us the detail of the challenges in doing so, and some of the opportunities that come from the project. So Jeremy, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning from, I was going to say sunny Chelmsford, but it's actually just dry and clouded over a little bit. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I mean, I'm just waiting, Martin. Is the slide deck showing? Ah, that's brilliant. Thank you. So if we can go on. So I'm Jeremy Potter, and I head up the spatial planning team at Chelmsford City Council, and I also chair the Essex Planning Officers Association. And I'm essentially going to talk about what we've been doing with our local plan and with planning policy matters in Chelmsford. And I'm afraid I don't necessarily have all the answers because we have faced some significant challenges in producing our local plan. But what we do feel is that we have developed a new plan which is formulated to maximise things like active travel, health and well-being, protecting and making the best use of our strategic green infrastructure, and pushing the whole sustainable construction element. And it's really taking on Rebecca's and Deryck's theme. It really is a kind of a wider place-based approach rather than a specific climate change approach, which is, we feel, led us to be in quite a good place to capitalise on some of these behavioural changes that are arising out of the pandemic that we are all facing. So if we just go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to Chelmsford for those that don't know. Chelmsford set out the opportunities that we've had in terms of our local plan, and some of the limitations as well in terms of reduction of our new local plan policy, and where we can't do what we want. And there has been some instances where we want to do more, but we've been pushed back. But what we've tried to do is to push back ourselves with the kind of nudging and incentivizing to try and change behaviour, so we kind of continue that journey to move forward and do things slightly differently. So if we go to the next slide, please, when I can just talk about our context a little bit. So Chelmsford It's right in the heart of Essex there, just to the northeast of London. We gained city status in 2012, and we have a population overall in our area of about 180,000 people, and about 100,000 people live in the city of Chelmsford. It's relatively prosperous, it's got a relatively high quality of life, it's got good transport connections, particularly into London, and also it's faced significant growth pressure, and also the council has had significant growth ambitions as well in relation to its new development and what we will achieve in Chelmsford. We've been achieving around about 1,000 new homes a year with the same amount of jobs. So we started that process of preparing a new local plan in 2013. But we had actually very late on in the process, we've had a change of political administration. We've changed to Liberal Democrat from quite a long period of Conservative control in Chelmsford. So that kind of changed the dynamic of our local plan right at the end of the process. And also the new administration, one of the first acts they did was to actually declare a climate and ecological emergency. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, Richard. So the opportunities that we found from the local plan, first of all, we've only just adopted it, so I think it's about 5 weeks old, so we're very pleased that we've managed to get that far, because I think we're all aware that actually getting a local plan through is a really quite hard job. I've done now, I think this is now the 6th one I've done from, and each time it gets slightly harder in relation to the examination process, the evidential requirements in relation to that whole process. So we had an existing local development framework that we adopted. We had 5 documents that we adopted through 2008 to 13. And those documents, those developments have been coming out of the ground. But what importantly is that those local development framework documents really focused on brownfield sites, because that was the real drive at that time. And we've only got a finite amount of brownfield sites in Chelmsford. The industrial town, industrial heritage, however, a finite resource which has essentially been pretty much used up on large scale in the city centre. So looking at greenfield sites more and the tendency of greenfield. And what we thought was really important, and drawing upon some of the themes that you've heard from previous presenters, is that actually we need to make absolute best use of our strategic green infrastructure in relation to where we locate those greenfield sites. Also balancing all sorts of other factors as well, which the planning system has to do. But the green infrastructure was the nub, and how it's linked, its role, its function, and how it could actually support more sustainable forms of development. So protecting it, but actually using it as a resource, a multifunctional resource to actually make the development that is close by in the locations that we chose actually more sustainable. And what we're very lucky, and you probably can't see particularly well on one of those diagrams there, is that we're actually at the confluence of 3 rivers in Chelmsford, which has actually afforded and provides a really good natural or green corridors right into the city centre. And we are very lucky in that regard, and maximising those opportunities that allows has enabled us to actually look at our green infrastructure as our structuring principle of where we locate new development. As I said, we are a growth location. We have a new 10,000 home garden community to plan just to the northeast of Chelmsford. We have 8 strategic sites to also plan. And interestingly, Deryck's point about master plans, something that we were very interested in terms of making sure that the master plans that are actually produced for each one of the developments, because we're not having a separate AAP or site allocations document to actually describe those details, actually are provided in practice. So what we've done is actually embed the master planning requirements within the site policy of each of the site allocations in the local plan to make sure that we absolutely don't have the situation where we have that watering down effect, which we have experienced in the past. So in addition to the kind of normal development standards that you'd see, the open space, the kind of parking, all those sorts of things, we wanted to make sure that we took advantage of all the optional additional building regulation requirements. So it's things like water efficiency. We're in an area of water stress in the east of England here. Internal space standards. Really important. We felt that actually having homes that are large enough to be able to actually function and have spaces and storage and ability to work at home, those are other things that are really important that are actually related to some of the issues that we are facing now. Accessibility, making sure that they're adaptable, pushing the building regs, and also things like for the non-residential, the BREEAM standard as well, electric charging points at all new residential and commercial developments, a new policy that enforces that, the biodiversity net gain policies, all of those things coming into the mix, that kind of place-based approach. But what we have found is by doing that and pushing the boundaries and not just going for the standard, we had to provide and actually get a lot of evidence to support that, because at an examination, we will be faced with people, predominantly the development industry, and others that may be pushing back on those in relation to some of those requirements. And also our new administration was keen to ensure, again, that we nudge further with our use of SPDs. I know they can't introduce new policy, but the guidance and examples, exemplars can show developers how actually you can do something different. So we go on to the next slide, please. And if we're talking about some of the limitations, building regulations and the uncertainty about what we can do and what we can't do in terms of things like energy efficiency was something that really limited us, I think, in some respects, in terms of some of the policies. Just a reminder, we were going through the old 2012 transitional MPPF for our new local plan. And although we wanted to push harder, our kind of advice, especially our legal advice, was saying that actually that could be problematic in terms of, especially in terms of energy efficiency. Renewables and the other optional stuff, obviously, if you have the evidence, then that could be actually brought forwards. And although it seems like there is some emerging clarity coming on in this in relation to other energy legislation and the new MPPF, we were faced with a situation where we had what we had, and we have to try and see whether we can balance those kind of carrots and sticks. Of course, with all planning decisions, there's always going to be competing needs and voices, and balancing that stick and carrots can sometimes, it did feel like we were walking a tightrope at times. But the overriding need to deliver new development does also come to the fore, particularly in terms of maintaining housing supply, making sure that our plans don't go out of date 18 months after we've spent 5 years preparing them, because we are measured about how many homes are provided. And if we don't, through the housing delivery tests, then our plans can be rendered out of date very quickly after they're adopted. So the more overt climate change priorities surfaced quite late in the preparation of our local plan. But as I said, what we were keen to do is have a really open conversation with developers as well, to try and convince them of the value of going further. And that has had mixed results. But I feel that it's incumbent upon us to continue that conversation. If I could just go to the next slide, please. So those nudges and incentives. We've got our SPD that is pushing that policy implementation. We're in a stage, our new administration is saying to us, well, within the period of plan, we're not going to have gas boilers. We're not going to have internal combustion engines, within this long-term period. So actually, we need to start thinking long-term rather than that kind of short incremental term. What we try to do through our SPDs is show those alternatives and showcase those before the building regs change. Also, to have show homes, Section 106 agreements that exemplar all of the additional extras that developers could provide in a show home that goes way beyond the policy in terms of sustainable construction and energy efficiency. The biodiversity net gain, in giving some further guidance about achieving at least 10% more biodiversity than what's on the site at the moment, and recycling and waste as well, some further guidance and pushing the boundaries in terms of not curbside collection, because the car and servicing of vehicles, if we carry on that more traditional route, it really does define how new places are master planned. Also, just a quick related, we've got a Live Well development accreditation, so we've tried to nudge developers to think about health and well-being by giving awards to new development that go beyond what policy provides, and for their marketing and for their ability to show that it's a healthy place. It adds value to their development. And also we're preparing across Essex the way of mitigating all of this impact that's happening in Essex of new development on the coast, because there's some really important wild coast on Essex with some really important nature and conservation designations. Can I go to the next slide, please? So finally, just those lessons learned. We really wanted to push the boundaries of policy with mixed results, so I can't say that that has been completely successful, but I think we've gone and pushed a lot further. I think the planning system can do a lot, but I don't think it can do it all, and sometimes we need other pieces of legislation that basically we implement, rather than having to go through that competition of balancing competing demands. This is so important that it actually needs to be something that is the starting point rather than a mixed result at the end. Evidence was key. If we didn't have the evidence, and I know other authorities have struggled when they've had really good aspirations, but that hasn't been supported by the evidence, and when you're in an examination, evidence is key. And also to engage early with developers to make sure that those developers can buy in to the processes that you are actually showing. And some of those photos are there. That's our first stage of the garden community at North East Chelmsford that's coming out of the ground at the moment, that has been based on a master plan which has green infrastructure at its heart and is an exemplar in the National Design Guide. So I think that's me done. Apologies if I've gone a little bit over time there, Martin, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Three very powerful perspectives there, three completely different but very entertaining presentations. Thank you very much. And also thank you to you out there for the questions you've submitted. Rebecca, get ready. The subject of rewilding comes up many a time. But in the first instance, if I can hand over to Deryck. So I know, Deryck, when we were talking about this session and we spoke about the various presentations, you had a few questions for Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. I guess the key one, this is me trying to get some operational value out of today, as well as just enjoying doing the presentation. You mentioned a number of times, Martin, Jeremy, that you'd moved green infrastructure to the heart of the thinking here, but that actually that had been relatively late in the process. How did that change what you did, and how has it changed the local plan as it emerged?
Okay, the green infrastructure side of things was actually at the heart of the policy right from the beginning. It was some of the other climate change elements where we probably would have wanted to push harder earlier. I think actually what's benefited is that the strategic green infrastructure has allowed us to effectively shape our spatial strategy around that. And actually, we've got cycleways, footways, all of the kind of the active travel all goes through our strategic infrastructure, green infrastructure, rather than actually, the normal kind of, building roads, the kind of more traditional approach to linking. Of course, we still need some strategic grey infrastructure, as it were. We've got a new railway station that has the HIF funding on the main line that will support our new garden community, and there is also a relief road. But in the past, our plans have always been based upon, you know, a long list of grey infrastructure, whereas now those two things are our key infrastructure, and everything else is on a zonal approach, maximising active travel, cycling, walking, and public transport. That kind of modal shift.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jeremy. And one more for you whilst you're on. This question is from Zach Claudino. Can you elaborate on what kind of extra evidence base you required above and beyond what you've experienced in the development of past local plans? And if you can keep that pretty brief, but can you do that?
Yeah, so for example, the national space standards, we had to look back at the development that we've had in the past in Chelmsford and actually kind of do a measure quite a lot of the development to see how substandard it was in terms of the size, because planning in private developments, as you would know, there isn't that requirement to actually have the space standards in unless you've got the policy. So that was one, and then others related to accessibility. So we had to get some further evidence in relation to how people use buildings and the different types of people that will use buildings over the lifetime, and the need for that, especially for older people. So we had to get some additional evidence in relation to those. So that's just two examples.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so plenty of questions coming in, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes. We appreciate we started this live broadcast a bit late, so we're going to carry on for about another 13, 14 minutes. This one is straightforward, I think, but who's got an answer for this? With the planning system focused on growth of 300,000 homes a year target, what tools are able to help planners in decision making to be able to give greater weight to climate change, mitigation, adaptation measures, and contribution, when economic viability erodes the quality of development outcomes and there is an overall drive for growth that weakens decision makers' positions? A broad question there, but can anyone come back on that one?
I'll have a go.
Richard, yes.
Well, one thing that it would be great if we could have was a way in which the benefits to owners and renters of more sustainable homes were easier to tell. Because at the moment, it's, you can choose a cheap home that costs a lot to heat, or possibly a more expensive one that is more of a passive house. But as a purchaser, it's not always that easy to realize how much you would benefit from making that choice. And also, a lot of homes are privately rented, and so there's a disconnect between who buys them and who lives in them, which makes it even more complicated. So I think that will be a way in which we would be able to support moving to better standards at the same time as driving towards 300,000 homes.
Right, okay, thank you for that. And as I mentioned to Rebecca, there are plenty of questions for rewilding. We will not get to all of them, but if I can kick off with one directly to you here. How will the rewilding network fit with local nature partnerships where they exist and emerging nature recovery networks? If done well, says, this is Jenny Wayne, if done well, they should integrate with local planning authorities. What's your view there?
Absolutely. I mean, the network that I'm talking about is a sort of web-based collaborative, almost a learning network, because what we're seeing is this massive upsurge in interest in what rewilding is and how to do it. So that network is around providing support to all those people, whether they be, from the Ministry of Defence to councils to individuals to gardens, because there just isn't that practical advice out there. And I'd love to work with some of you guys to look at some practical guidance on rewilding and the planning system, for instance. That would be great. But we also, yes, would like to see a massive upscaling of the connectivity of sort of working with existing initiatives, because obviously there's the nature recovery networks, there's lots of large scale initiatives underway. Some national parks are trying to actually create wild areas, so it's not that we're starting from a sort of zero base, but actually the scale of the ambition of what needs to happen if we are going to have an impact in terms of climate emergency, we need to massively upscale that and increase the connectivity and the incentives provided to do so.
Okay, thank you. This question across the piece, I think, it's really welcome to hear discussion of large-scale rewilding, and this is needed for climate adaptation. How can local planning authorities plan for this when many rural land uses, for example, the management of upland areas, fall outside of the planning system? How does the system need to change?
I could very briefly comment that, Martin. I mentioned in my presentation that at the moment in Scotland we have two parallel incentives looking at regional planning. One looking at spatial plan as part of the new national planning framework, and the other looking at land use planning. And we're trying where we can to initially give them the same geographies, so that you have two sets of discussions going on about the same areas at the same time, and to try and build those links across. But you know, your question is right, that the two things do not sit well together, and it relates to what Jeremy said at the end of his, which is that the planning system can't do all of this. Some of this has to be driven by policy, and some of it has to be driven by new ways of collaboratively working, and we can't rely on the planning system, which is driven by a very specific set of goals, to deliver way beyond those particular criteria.
Okay, and Richard, you had your hand up, Richard.
The RTPI is pushing, along with our friend in the Broadway initiative, for the creation of single environment plans over larger areas than one local authority, to replace, there's something like 20 different kinds of environment plans that apply to individual territories. And this is, you know, interestingly, the legacy of the European Union, which has introduced a whole series of directives piecemeal on the environment. And then we would also argue that those local environment plans should be aligned with local spatial plans and leading in the same direction. This would take, you know, a while to get to, and the environment bill is probably well shaped to enable this to happen, but it's a bit below the level of Acts of Parliament. It's more a question of what people actually do.
Okay, sorry, Jeremy, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would really echo what Richard's just said there, and we did it on a micro scale, but actually, you know, our river valleys go way beyond, you know, our administrative areas, and to deal with just our geography isn't really getting to the nub of what we really need to achieve.
All right, okay. Now I've got a broader one here, but we've got time for I'm sorry, Rebecca, did you want to say something there?
Oh, just quickly, I mean, I would really support that. I think what we need is integrated spatial planning on a larger scale, perhaps at a catchment level, where we look at how we can make the best use of our natural assets and resources to most benefit for people, climate, and nature. And unless we do so, it's always going to be piecemeal and sector-based rather than integrated.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got time for about 2 more questions at absolute most. The first one here is related to topical events. What environmental opportunities might arise from the large reduction in retail that we may be looking at? I appreciate that's quite a broad and speculative question, but does anyone have a response on that one? Maybe not. Let's move on. Bear with me a second. Let's see, so excuse me a second. Oh yes, another one for you, Jeremy. This one, great to see green infrastructure leading master planning. Are you finding this is having an effect on densities and hence car reliance? Is it too soon for that, but are you seeing an effect?
Our first initial results is that actually we are achieving the modal shift that we were seeking to gain. So it's just making sure it's the edges of the master plan. And again, this is what we're talking about. Again, looking at it comprehensively is really important. There's no point in having a master plan that looks inside its boundaries. It has to look outside of its boundaries and how that connects into the wider network. And that's why having a bigger plan dealing with that connectivity is really, really important to enable us to achieve what we want to achieve.
Okay, thank you. This one, not a question, but an observation. Great to have Deryck on here with a presentation from Scotland about what's happening, as it's so often a focus on English planning issues. You're very welcome, Anne. And then one more question, I'm afraid, because it's already midday. If you can bear with me, it's going to be, COVID has taught many of us the importance of nature, including for health and well-being. Will net biodiversity gain provisions be enough to secure the recovery of nature? If not, then what can the planning system best do to assist it? Does anyone have a response on that?
Very quick one, I would say no, because I may be controversial here, but I don't like the concept of net gain, because I think you can't replace an ancient woodland with a field full of planted trees. Or so I mean, I think we should recognise, I mean, it links back to that kind of integrated spatial planning and the importance of returning spaces or restoring nature and nature's recovery and kind of natural regeneration in that. So I would say no, but that we need to integrate nature's recovery into at least, I mean, we would say at least 30% of Britain's land and seas by 2030 if we're going to have an impact at all.
Okay. Right, well, thank you.
Working with DEFRA, it's kind of heresy to ever question biodiversity net gain. But I think at the same time, there is quite a lot of movement at quite high level and among NGOs to press for environmental net gain, which will go further than the very narrow definition. So one way of looking at biodiversity net gain is it's a sort of foot in the door, which may open to perhaps more broader and better advised concepts, but it's a start.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard.